Before this story begins, take a moment to subscribe because some voices deserve to be heard, no matter how long they've been silenced. I remember the sound before I remember the faces. The slow, rasping sound of burlap sacks being dragged across the floor. 3 of them, full of grain. I didn't know then that each one had a price my price. The sun was cruel that afternoon in 1970, slicing through the cracks of our wooden shack in Hollow Ridge, Alabama. Dust floated in the air like tiny ghosts, spinning lazily in the heat. Mama was crying by the doorway, her hands trembling around the edge of her apron. I could smell the salt of her tears mixed with the dry earth. I stood there, barefoot, my feet cracked and bleeding from the dirt road, and listened as Earl, my stepfather, spat into the ground and said to Mr. Jennings, the store owner, "She'll do fine. Strong girl. Don't give me less than what we agreed." The man in the brown hat didn't look at me, not really. He just counted out 3 sacks of cornmeal and said, "Deal's a deal." His voice was cold, like he was talking about cattle, not a child. Mama took a step toward me then, whispering, "Please, Earl, don't do this." But he shoved her back, muttering something about another mouth to feed, and God helps those who help themselves. I didn't understand all the words, but I understood enough. I was being traded when Mr. Jennings grabbed my arm. I didn't fight. I just looked back at Mama one last time. Her lips moved without sound, but I knew she was saying forgive me. The cart jolted forward, the wheels cutting through the red dirt road, and I felt the world fall away behind me. For a while, I tried to believe it was temporary, that Mama would come for me once she convinced him to change his mind. But the further we went, the smaller the road became, the dust swallowing the sky, until all I could see was the back of that man's coat and the faint outline of the store sign ahead. Jennings General Supply. That would be my new home. The store smelled of old tobacco, kerosene, and loneliness. He put me to work immediately, sweeping the floor, stacking canned peaches, washing the counters. My hands blistered within hours, but I said nothing. Silence became my armor. I was not a girl anymore. I was a transaction. That night, when the store closed, he sat by the lamp and read the newspaper. "You'll sleep in the back room," he said. "Don't make noise. Don't wander." I nodded, clutching the thin blanket he'd tossed me. I could hear the cicadas outside screaming into the darkness, their song sharp and endless, like my heartbeat. Lying on the cold floorboards, I realized that something inside me had cracked wide open. It wasn't just fear. It was a hollow understanding that my life no longer belonged to me. I wasn't sure if it ever had, and yet, as the night stretched on and the store grew quiet, I made myself a promise. One day, I'd run. One day, I'd never let anyone trade me again. The mornings came early at Jennings General Supply. Before the sun even touched the cracked window glass, I was already awake, sweeping dust from the corners, washing the jars, trying to breathe through the smell of kerosene and mild. Jennings never said much, just barked orders and expected me to obey. I learned quickly that silence kept me safe. Sometimes customers would come in, farmers, truckers, women with tired eyes and calloused hands, and they'd glance at me with curiosity. A girl working behind the counter at 13 wasn't something you saw often, even out here. Some would ask where I came from, and I'd just say South Hollow, because it sounded vague enough to stop question. By noon, the heat would press down on the roof until the air shimmered. I could feel sweat running down my back, soaking my faded dress. My stomach ached most days, from hunger, from fear. I couldn't tell any more. But at night, when the store closed, I started to notice things. Men would come by after dark. They didn't buy anything. They talked, whispered Dartmoor. Jennings would pour drinks, close the blinds, and their voices would turn low and mean. I'd press my ear to the thin wall of the back room, catching pieces of conversation that twisted my gut. "She's young," one voice said. "She'll do," another replied. Then Mr. Jennings's tone, slick like oil. "The Colonel pays good money, more than any of you could dream of." The Colonel. That name haunted me for weeks before I even saw the man. I tried to convince myself it wasn't about me, that maybe they were talking about horse or workers or something else entirely. But one night, when Mr. Jennings thought I was asleep, I heard him on the phone. "She's ready. Strong. Quiet. No trouble at all. When you want her, just say the word." I remember clutching the thin blanket so tight my knuckles turned white. My heart was pounding so loud I thought he'd hear it from the next. That was the moment I knew I hadn't been saved from hunger. I'd just been moved closer to something far worse. Days later, the Colonel came. His name was Pratt, though everyone called him the Colonel out of habit, a title left over from some long-forgotten war. He arrived in a shiny black car, the kind I'd never seen up close before, dust rising around the tires like smoke. He wore a white hat and boots that gleamed like bone. When he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. He shook Mr. Jennings's hand, and I noticed how tightly Jennings gripped it, the kind of grip that meant money had changed hands or soon would. The Colonel looked at me once, slowly, from head to toe, and nodded. "She'll do." That night, I cried quietly into the blanket, the first time since Mama's face disappeared down the red road. I thought of her tears, of the 3 sacks of cornmeal, and wondered if she'd felt the same kind of shame I did now, the kind that eats through your bone until you start believing you deserve it. But beneath the fear, something else began to grow. It wasn't strength, not yet, but it was close. It was defiance. A small, burning spark that whispered, "They can trade my body, but they'll never own my will." And when I overheard Mr. Jennings say, "The Colonel wants her by Sunday," I knew Sunday would never come for them the way they planned. Sunday would come for me, and it would be the night I disappeared. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old store sounded like a warning. Every whisper of wind through the cracks felt like a voice telling me, go before it's too late. My heart beat so loud it drowned out my thoughts. I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, counting breaths and plans that didn't make sense. By morning, the sun rose red, thick as blood on the horizon. I went about my chores quietly, sweeping, filling shelves, wiping counters, pretending nothing had changed. But inside, every second felt sharper, more dangerous. Mr. Jennings watched me like a hawk that already knew its prey was trembling. Around noon, his wife, Mrs. Neva, appeared in the doorway. I had never looked at her properly before. She always kept to the back of the house. Her perfume and pearls so out of place in that dusty store. She didn't smile when she saw me. Her eyes were tired, heavy, like she carried too many secrets. That evening, when Jennings went to the back room to count his money, she came closer. You look like you haven't eaten in days, she said softly. I didn't answer. You learned early in life that silence could keep you alive. She sighed. He's sending you to Colonel Pratt, isn't he? The words froze me. My hands stopped moving over the counter. I didn't know what to say, or if I should say anything at all. She looked away before I could answer. You're not the first, and you won't be the last unless you do something. My chest tightened. Do something, I whispered, afraid of even saying it out loud. Neva's eyes glistened. Run Dot tonight, before he comes for you. For the first time in months, I felt tears threaten to fall, not from pain, but from the shock of someone finally seeing me. I nodded, but she grabbed my wrist. Her fingers were cold, trembling. Listen carefully. You'll take the back alley, through the field. There's a bus at the old Sinclair station at midnight. Last one heading east to Raleigh. I'll leave some money on the windowsill. Enough for a ticket and food. Don't look back, no matter what you hear. I wanted to thank her, but the words wouldn't come. Gratitude and terror battled in my chest. That night, after Jennings locked up, I waited until the house went silent. The ticking of the old clock in the hallway marked every second of my fear. Midnight crept closer, heavy as a storm. I slipped on my worn shoes, the ones with the hole near the toe, and tied my small bundle of clothes with a piece of string. When I opened the window, the air hit me, cold, raw, free. The world outside was black, but I didn't care. Freedom didn't need light. It only needed a heartbeat. As I climbed out, I looked back one last time. Mrs. Neva stood at her window across the hallway, her silhouette faint against the lamp's glow. She lifted her hand, a silent goodbye, or maybe a prayer. I ran, barefoot half the way, breath burning my lungs, fear biting at my heels. Every sound behind me felt like footsteps, every shadow a hand reaching to drag me back. The road to the Sinclair station stretched endlessly, the night swallowing me whole. When the bus appeared, rumbling and old, it looked like salvation painted in rust. The driver barely glanced at me, just took the crumpled bills and waved me in. I sat by the window, pressing my face against the cool glass. The engine groaned, and the road started to move beneath me. For the first time since that day on the red road, I wasn't someone's property. I didn't know what waited in Raleigh or anywhere beyond that horizon, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never again be traded like grain or meal. The bus rumbled on, carrying me toward a future I couldn't yet imagine. And as the stars flickered faintly above the black fields, I whispered a promise into the night. You'll never own me again. When the bus stopped in Raleigh, the sun had barely risen, but the city already moved like a creature with too many legs. Cars roared down wide gray streets, horns blared, and people hurried past me, not seeing, not caring. I stepped down from the bus, clutching the small paper bag Mrs. Neva had given me. Inside, $2, a boiled egg, and half a biscuit wrapped in cloth. It was everything I owned in the world. The air smelled different there. Damp asphalt, fried food, gasoline. For a girl who grew up breathing dust and smoke, it was dizzying, almost sweet. Still, every sound made me flinch. I was 13, barefoot, and alone in a city that didn't even know I existed. I wandered for hours, trying to find somewhere that felt safe. People stared. A man selling newspapers whistled and shouted something I didn't understand. I walked faster. When my legs gave out, I sat on the curb outside a bakery, the smell of fresh bread twisting my empty stomach. That's when she found me, Mrs. Eleanor, an old woman in a blue dress with buttons missing. Her voice was raspy, the kind that had seen too many cigarettes and too many disappointments. You look like you've been running for miles, she said. I didn't answer. Trust wasn't something you could rebuild in a single sentence. She crouched beside me, studying my face with a softness I hadn't seen in years. You hungry? I nodded, just once. She handed me a paper bag. Inside, a roll still warm. Eat, she said simply. By the time I finished it, tears had started without my permission. She didn't ask why. She just sat there, letting me cry, like it was something normal. Then she stood up and said, "Come on." I got a room that's warmer than the street. Her house was small, creaky, filled with the smell of old wood and lavender soap. "You can stay here," she said, "if you help around the place. Sweep, wash dishes, that kind of thing." For the first time in forever, I slept in a bed, soft, with clean sheets, and no fear crawling underneath. That night, I dreamed of the red soil back home, but in my dream, it rained. The earth drank it like a promise. Days turned into weeks. I worked quietly, scrubbing, washing, dusting, and Mrs. Eleanor treated me not like a servant, but like someone who mattered. She'd tell stories of her youth, of dancing by rivers and losing her husband to the mines. Sometimes she'd catch me listening too closely and smile. "You got old eyes for someone so young," she'd say. One afternoon, while I was sweeping the porch, a woman stopped by. She wore glasses and carried a stack of books. "You must be the new girl," she said. "I'm Regina." I teach at the night school down the street. The word school hit something deep inside me. I hadn't held a pencil since I was 9. I'd almost forgotten the feeling of writing my name. Regina smiled. You can come if you want. Doesn't matter if you start late. That night, after finishing the dishes, I asked Mrs. Eleanor if I could go. She looked at me quietly, then nodded. If learning keeps your soul from drying up, go on, child. So I did. 3 nights a week, I sat in a small classroom that smelled of chalk and coffee, surrounded by grown-ups chasing forgotten dreams. I learned to read again, to write, to imagine. Every new word was a small victory over the silence I'd lived in for years. But even as the city began to feel less like a monster and more like a possibility, my past never really left me. Some nights, when the wind hit the windows just right, I could still hear the creak of the Mercy area's door, could still feel the eyes of the man who decided what my life was worth. One evening, Mrs. Regina handed me an old book, Little Women. You'll like this one, she said. It's about girls who refuse to be small. I read it under the dim kitchen light until my eyes blurred. And for the first time, I didn't see just ink on paper. I saw escape. I saw proof that someone like me could exist beyond fear. I started to dream again, not of survival, but of living, of maybe one day becoming a teacher like Regina, or helping girls like me find their voices before the world sold them for 3 sacks of anything. Still, every morning, when I washed the floor or looked out the window, I wondered what happened to my mother, to my brothers, to the little house swallowed by the red dust of Carnindi. And when the letters came from the north, stories of deaths, of disappearances, of a man named Pratt shot dead in a land dispute, I realized something was changing. My past wasn't gone. It was moving, shifting, waiting for me to face it. That's when I knew I had to go back. The decision came quietly, like a whisper I could no longer ignore. I was 16 when I told Mrs. Eleanor and Regina that I was going back to Canfield, back to the place that tried to bury me. They both tried to talk me out of it, Regina especially. You've built a life here, she said, her brow creasing, as if my choice wounded her. What good can come from digging up ghosts? I looked at her across the small kitchen table, the one where I'd learned to hold a pen again. Because they're not buried, I said. They're still breathing in my head. I need to see what's left. That night, Regina brought home a newspaper. A small article buried on the last page read, Local rancher found dead in land dispute. Samuel Pratt, 58. The name struck like a thunderclap. The man who once claimed to own me was gone. My hands trembled as I held the paper, the ink smearing under my fingers. Dead. But the relief didn't come. Only questions. Only the ghost of every other girl who never made it out alive. I packed what little I had, 2 dresses, a sweater, a notebook, and the book Little Women. Mrs. Eleanor pressed a small locket into my palm. It was my daughter's, she said. She didn't make it past 20. You will. I boarded the early morning bus. Its metal seats cold beneath my skin. The road to Canfield stretched long and cruel, like the years I'd spent trying to forget. Outside, the horizon was cracked and pale, a wasteland of memories waiting to swallow me whole. The closer I got, the more the landscape felt like a wound reopening. The red dirt roads, the dying trees, the smell of drought, it was all there, unchanged. Like time had refused to move forward. When I stepped off the bus, people stared again. But this time, I wasn't the same frightened girl they'd once known. I walked through the dusty streets, past the old church, the dry well, and the square where I used to sell guava candy with my brothers. Everything was smaller, quieter. The Mercy area was gone, burned down, someone told me. Happened after Pratt's men came through, a shopkeeper said. Whole place went up in flames. Good riddance, but it wasn't the store I came for. It was the house. When I reached it, or what was left of it, my legs nearly gave way. The roof had caved in, the walls eaten by wind and neglect. Only the frame of the door remained standing, a skeleton of what once trapped me. If this story moves you, give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs hope. An old fisherman, Mr. Johnson, saw me standing there. His face was sunburnt, his eyes tired. You're Mary Louise, ain't you? He asked softly. I remember when they took you away. My throat closed. What happened to my family? He sighed, looking at the ground. Your brother Samuel died that summer. Hunger took him. Your mama, she lost her mind after that. Died not long after. We buried her near the river. He pointed toward a patch of dry grass. Your other two, Tommy and June, we took him in. Delva's been raising Em. You should go see her. The words barely reached me. It was like I was hearing someone else's tragedy. My knees gave out, and I fell to the dirt, my hands digging into the dry soil. The same earth that once burned my feet now held the bones of my mother. I don't remember how long I cried, only that the wind didn't move and the sun felt cruelly bright. When I finally reached Dalva's house, she opened the door and gasped. Lord above, Mary Louise. Behind her, two young faces appeared, Tommy and June, taller, older, but unmistakable. My brother ran to me first, his arms tight around my waist. I thought you were gone, he said, voice breaking. I whispered, but I came back. That night, Dalva told me everything. The deals, the other girls, the secret trade that Pratt and my stepfather ran, selling daughters like cattle to the ranch. My stepfather fled after Pratt's death. No one ever saw him again. The town had started to change, she said. The papers had begun printing stories. The police were finally asking questions. Some of the missing girls had been found, broken but alive. I should have felt peace, but all I felt was fury, not just for me, but for them, for every girl who never got on that bus. That's when the thought came. Maybe my life wasn't meant to end here. Maybe all that pain had to mean something. When dawn came, I stood by my mother's grave, the river whispering behind me. I placed Mrs. Eleanor's locket in the dirt. You did what you could, I said softly. Now I'll do the rest. I turned toward the horizon, the road that led back to the city, back to life. I wasn't going to hide anymore. Raleigh was colder than I remember, both in weather and in spirit. I rented a single room above a bakery, the kind of place where the walls smelled like flour and hope, but the floorboards creaked like they were complaining. I found work cleaning offices during the day and sewing in the evenings for a woman named Mrs. Harlow, who ran a small dress shop on Main Street. Every cent I earned went into an envelope I hid under a loose plank beneath my bed. It was for Tommy and June, for school, for something better. The city was full of noise, trams, engines, people, but inside me there was still silence. The kind that only trauma leaves, heavy and suffocating. Nights were the worst. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, hearing Samuel Pratt's boots outside my door again, his voice hissing through the dark. Some nights I swore I could smell the river, the one where my mother's grave now lay, wrapped in the soil of Canfield. Mrs. Harlow was kind, but curious. One afternoon she asked, "You don't talk much about where you're from, do you, dear?" I smiled faintly, pretending to be too busy cutting fabric. There's not much left to tell, but there always was. It clawed at me from the inside, begging to be spoken. Regina still wrote to me once a month. Her letters came perfumed with rosewater and folded so neatly they almost didn't look touched by human hands. "You have survived the worst," she wrote once. "Now you must decide what that survival is for." I kept that one under my pillow. 2 years passed before I felt strong enough to breathe without counting the second. June got accepted into nursing school in Durham. Tommy started apprenticing with a mechanic. When I hugged them goodbye, I felt both proud and hollow. Everything I'd lived through was meant to bring them here, to safety. And yet, when I watched them leave, I realized how empty safety can feel when you've built it from ashes. It was around that time the first newspaper article came out. Women of the Plain, the forgotten victims of rural trafficking. The name of the journalist was Eleanor Simmons. Mrs. Eleanor. My heart stopped when I saw the byline. The article told everything. My story. Our story. She'd changed the names, but I knew. Every line, every detail. It was there. The fear, the nights, the men who thought poor girls were disposable. I went to the library that week and found her address listed in a tiny directory at the front desk. 2 weeks later, I stood at her doorstep, clutching the letter she'd sent me years before. She opened the door slowly, her gray hair pinned back like always. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want to speak for you," she said, before I even asked. But the truth was rotting inside me. "You didn't speak for me," I said. "You spoke with me. That night we stayed up talking until the oil lamp burned low. She asked me to help her to tell my story, not in whisper, but on record for the world to hear. She said she was starting a foundation, one that would help girls like me find safety, education, and a voice. At first, I refused. I didn't think I could stand in front of anyone and talk about what they'd done to me. But she insisted, your voice will save more than your silence ever could. So I agreed. Slowly, cautiously. The first speech I gave was at a church in Wilmington, 1954. I wore a plain navy dress and gloves too big for my hands. My voice shook so much that some women in the back began to cry before I finished my first sentence. I was 12. I began, staring at the cracked wooden cross behind the pulpit. And the man who hurt me told me no one would ever believe a poor girl's word. But I'm here, and you're listening. That means he was wrong. By the end, the room was silent, that heavy, sacred kind of silence that happens when the truth finally lands somewhere safe. After that night, I never stopped speaking. Schools, churches, town halls, anywhere they'd have me. Sometimes I'd see girls in the crowd, eyes wide and trembling, and I'd know they understood every word I said. But the cost of remembering never went away. Every story I told was a wound reopen. Every night I'd sit by the window, watching the street lights flicker, wondering if healing ever really comes, or if we just learn to live inside the pain without letting it swallow. One evening, after a talk at a community center, a young woman approached. She must have been 17. She held my hands and whispered. He told me the same thing, that no one would believe me. Her voice broke. But I do, I said, holding her tighter, because I've lived it. And right there, I understood what survival was for. It wasn't about escaping. It was about returning, again and again, to pull someone else out of the dark. By 1956, the world had started to whisper my name. Not Mary Louise the orphan, not Mary Louise the girl who vanished, but Mary Louise Carter, the woman who spoke truth to power. My story had been printed in the Charlotte Observer, then in the Washington Post, and soon after, I was invited to speak in Washington, D.C. It felt unreal, me standing in rooms filled with polished men in suits, their eyes wide and uncomfortable as I described what happened to a poor girl in a forgotten corner of North Carolina. They called it a tragedy of circumstance. I called it what it was, human greed and silence. But fame, if that's what it was, came with ghosts. One crisp November evening, after finishing a talk at a women's college in Virginia, a man approached me as the crowd dispersed. His face was lined and familiar in a way that made my stomach turn. The smell of tobacco hit first, then the slant of his jaw. It was Earl Whitmore, Samuel Pratt's old foreman, the man who'd once dragged me back to that cabin when I tried to run. He smiled too easily. You've made quite the name for yourself, Mary Louise. My throat went dry. You have 5 seconds to leave. He laughed, low and slow. Now, That's no way to talk to someone who knows where the bones are buried. I froze. He leaned closer, his breath thick with whiskey. The colonel wasn't the only one, you know. There were others, men who paid good money. Maybe I should tell your fine city friends how far that little business went. I wanted to scream, to strike him, but I didn't. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "You go ahead and tell them, every single one, because I'm not the one hiding anymore." His smirk faltered, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. He left that night, and I never saw him again. But I couldn't sleep for days. I'd thought telling my story would exorcise the demons, but it only gave them names, faces, memories to reel to bury. Mrs. Eleanor, now gray and frail, but still sharp as glass, told me, "They fear you, Mary. That's why they whisper. That's why they threaten." A month later, I began receiving letters, anonymous, cruel, written in blocky handwriting. "Liar, you enjoyed it. You're bringing shame on this town." I burned the first few. Then I stopped burning them. I kept them in a box under my bed. Proof that even when truth rises, hate refuses to die quietly. But there were letters of another kind too, hundreds from women and girls who'd been hurt, silenced, sold, forgotten. Your story gave me courage. One read. I thought I was the only one. Those words kept me breathing. By 1958, I'd helped Eleanor establish the Rose Foundation, named after her favorite flower, and, secretly, after my mother. We worked to give shelter, education, and justice to women who had nowhere else to go. I poured myself into it, body and soul. I spoke in courthouses, pleaded before state officials, demanded investigations into rural trafficking networks that still existed in hidden corners of the South. Some doors slammed in my face. Others opened just enough to let light in. But the light came with a price. I couldn't escape the past, not completely. Each case we uncovered sounded like an echo of my own. Girls traded for labor, or for worse, under the guise of debt, family, or survival. And every time I heard it, I felt that old weight pressing on my chest again. The one that whispered, "You can't save them all." Sometimes I'd walk by the river in Raleigh at dusk, the sky melting into gold and violet. I'd close my eyes and see my mother's hands, rough, cracked, trembling, as she pressed mine the last time we were together. I used to think she'd been weak, that she hadn't fought for me. But now I understood. She'd fought in her own way, by surviving as long as she could in a world that devoured women like us. That realization broke me open and healed me all at once. It was that same year I received a telegram that changed everything. It was short, typed in all caps, "Found records. Need to talk, urgent. Regina." I hadn't heard from her in years. I took the first train to Boston, my heart pounding with a mix of dread and hope. She met me at the station, her hair now silver, her smile still steady. We sat in a cafe across from the old university where she taught literature. She slid a file across the table, thin, worn, official-looking. "Mary," she said softly, "I think you deserve to know the full truth about who sold my breath card." It was Samuel Pratt. She shook her head. "Not just him." Her eyes met mine, gentle but unflinching. "It was your stepfather. He made the deal." The cafe went silent around me. The sound of plates, laughter, footsteps, it all faded. My father, the man I'd defended when neighbors called him cruel. The man my mother cried for when he disappeared. "He didn't sell you for money," Regina said. "He traded you for forgiveness, for debts." I sat there, staring at the paper, unable to breathe. All those years of blaming strangers, of believing evil came from the outside, and all along, it had lived inside my home. I returned to Willow Creek in the summer of 1959, 19 years after I'd been sold. The train ride felt endless, each mile dragging me closer to a place that had once devoured my innocence. From the window, the landscape changed from the steel pulse of Raleigh to the soft, haunting quiet of Carolina farmland. The fields looked smaller than I remember, or maybe I had just grown too large for them, too full of ghosts. When I stepped onto the cracked platform of the old station, the air hit me like a memory. Dust, smoke, and that faint sweetness of honeysuckle that used to bloom behind our house. The town hadn't changed much. Same peeling signs, same gossip lingering in the air like humidity. People stared when I passed, some with recognition, some with something darker. They whispered my name like it was a curse. I walked the half-mile to the old Whitmore property. My shoes sank into the dirt road, the sun sharp and merciless above. The farmhouse stood crooked, weathered by time and sin. The porch sagged, the windows were boarded, but the place still breathed. I could feel it watching me. Inside, everything smelled of mold and dust. My fingers trailed across a table scarred with cigarette burns. The same table where Samuel Pratt had signed the paper that sealed my fate. I stood there for a long time, imagining my 13-year-old self sitting by that door, barefoot and scared, waiting for her mother to come back and realizing she never would. That was when I heard the creak. Someone was there. A man stepped out from the back room, slower than memory. His hair was white, his skin drawn tight against his bones. But his eyes, pale, gray, cold, I would have known them anywhere. "Mary Louise," he rasped. His voice was the scrape of gravel. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again. Hello, Earl," I said, though I wanted to spit his name. He laughed once, dry and low. "You shouldn't have come back. There's nothing left for you here. I didn't come for something. I came for the truth." He leaned on the doorframe, smirking. "Truth don't feed nobody. Truth don't change nothing." I took a step closer. "Then maybe it can bury you." His smirk faltered. From my coat pocket, I pulled the document Regina had given me, a yellowed, stamped page with 2 signatures at the bottom. One was Samuel Pratt's. The other belonged to John Carter, my stepfather. My hand shook as I unfolded it, holding it up like a weapon. You traded me, I said, my voice breaking. You sold me to clear your debts. He didn't deny it. He just looked away, muttering, "You wouldn't understand. Times were hard. A man does what he has to do to survive. A man," I said, the words trembling. "You weren't a man. You were a coward." He looked back at me, something flickering in his eyes, shame or defiance. I couldn't tell. "You think I didn't pay for it? Your mama never forgave me. She drank herself into the grave. And every night I saw your face, the way you looked when they took you. I hear that sound in my head still. You don't get to feel sorry," I said softly. "Not now. Not after what you did." We stood in silence, the years hanging heavy between us. I thought I'd feel rage, maybe relief. Instead, there was only emptiness, like the moment after a storm when everything's too still. "I didn't come for revenge," I whispered finally. "I came to end it." He closed his eyes, his voice cracking for the first time. "Then end it, girl. Tell the world. Do what you came to do." I turned and walked out without looking back. The door slammed behind me, echoing like a gunshot. Outside, the heat pressed against me, thick and suffocating. I sat on the steps of that collapsing porch and cried, not for him, not even for me, but for every girl whose voice had been stolen and buried under someone else's sin. That night, I stayed in the old boarding house near Main Street. The next morning, I went to the sheriff's office. The same badge that once ignored my disappearance now stared from behind a new face, a younger man, nervous, clean-shaven. "I want to file a statement," I said, "about the trafficking that happened here 20 years ago. About the men involved." He hesitated. "Ma'am, that's a long time ago." I dropped the file on his desk. "Then it's about time someone remembered." He looked through the papers, names, location, statements. I had spent years collecting every piece of evidence I could find. He looked up at me differently now, not as a victim, but as a witness. "I'll make sure this is taken seriously," he said quietly. As I left, the church bells rang across the town square, the same bells that once marked the hour I was taken. Only this time, they sounded like a requiem for the dead and a prayer for the living. I didn't know then that those bells would also mark the beginning of a storm. The investigation would stir old secrets, draw old enemies back into the light, and reveal something about my mother I never dared to imagine. I couldn't sleep that night. The ceiling of the boarding house blurred into shadows, each one twisting into faces I knew too well. My stepfather, Samuel Pratt, and the silent, sorrowful figure of my mother. I'd come back to Willow Creek thinking I knew the story. But the town had secrets buried deeper than the cracked roads and abandoned fields. The next morning, I went to the churchyard, the one where my mother had been buried nearly 15 years ago. The soil was dry, cracked from months without rain, and the gravestone leaned slightly to the right. My fingers traced her name, Margaret Louise Carter, feeling the grooves etched into stone. I whispered her name, expecting nothing, yet hoping for some spark of understanding. It was then that Father Thomas, the parish priest, approached me. He had aged in ways that made him unrecognizable, his robes thin and worn, his eyes lined with the weight of decades. "Mary Louise," he said softly, "you've returned to stir the past. Are you prepared for what you might find?" "I think I have to," I replied. My voice trembled, not from fear, but from the anticipation of confronting truth I had avoided for years. He led me to the church office, a dusty room filled with old ledgers, letters, and parish record. He pulled out a thin envelope, yellowed and brittle with age. "Your mother, she tried to protect you more than you ever realized." I froze. "Protect me? How?" She didn't stop him." Father Thomas shook his head. "She did what she could, Mary Louise. She tried to alert the sheriff at the time, tried to leave town, but Samuel Pratt's influence ran deeper than anyone suspected. Your mother's attempts were silenced by fear and threats. She paid a terrible price for her silence. The heartbreak, the alcohol, the illness that claimed her." I sank into the chair, the letter trembling in my hands. It was a confession, written in her trembling hand years before she died. If they ever take her, let her remember I loved her. I am weak, but my heart is hers. I cannot save her, but I will never stop praying. Tears blurred my vision. All this time, I had blamed her for leaving me, for not fighting harder. I had imagined her indifference, her complicity. But this was a different truth. My mother had been trapped by power and fear, fighting an impossible battle silent. I stood and walked to the window, looking out over the town I had both loved and feared. The wind carried the scent of honeysuckle again, faint but present, as if whispering forgiveness through the air. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't for her or for me. It was for the part of myself I had locked away for years. I sat in the churchyard again, reading her words over and over, letting them settle into the raw spaces of my memory. I felt a strange mix of anger, sorrow, and relief. My mother had loved me in her flawed, constrained, human way, and that love, though imperfect, had given me a thread to cling to, a reason to survive, and a reason to rebuild. The revelation shook me to my core. It meant the betrayal I had carried for decades was not absolute. It meant I had a chance to rewrite the ending, not as a victim, but as a survivor, as someone who could honor both her struggle and my own. That night, I walked through the empty streets of Willow Creek, my heart heavy, but lighter than it had been in years. I understood now that survival wasn't just escaping. It was seeing the truth, however painful, and finding a way to hold it without letting it destroy you. I realized that my fight wasn't over. There were still others like me, hidden in shadows, waiting for someone to give voice to their story. And I knew that my next step would be to shine a light on every dark corner I had once been forced to hide in. As I looked at the moon hanging over the broken rooftops. I felt a sense of resolve harden within me. The past had shaped me, yes, but it would not define me. And in that moment, I knew I would finally take the story I had carried alone for decades and make it a beacon for those still trapped in silence. The dawn broke over Willow Creek with a muted, hesitant light, as if the town itself was still unsure it had survived the long shadow of the past. I walked along the cracked sidewalks, memories pressing against my chest like a physical weight, each step echoing the long, silent scream I had carried for decades. The wind carried the faint scent of honeysuckle again, reminding me that even in the most barren places, life could find a way. I had returned not just to confront the ghosts of my family, but to reclaim the power they had tried to steal from me. The streets, the houses, the dry fields, they were all witnesses to my childhood's cruelty, but they would also witness my survival. I visited the remnants of my old home. The walls were crumbling, the roof partially collapsed, and the air smelled of dust and decay. I pressed my palm against the weathered wood, feeling the echoes of the girl I had once been, small, terrified, and powerless. And then I let myself cry for her, for the life stolen, and for the strength I had finally reclaimed. With the help of Father Thomas, Professor Regina, and the few allies I had found over the years, I began reaching out to other survivors, to those whose voices had been silenced by fear or shame. Letters, phone calls, whispered conversations in dark corners. Slowly, the web of silence began to unravel. I documented the stories of girls who had been taken, sold, or threatened, weaving together a record of truth that could not be ignored. Each story was a shard of the past, each survivor a spark of resistance. I returned to the school where I had once studied in secret, now carrying photographs and testimonies. The principal, Mrs. Larkin, met me with a mix of surprise and reverence. "Mary Louise, you've done what many couldn't even imagine," she said softly. I nodded, feeling the gravity of decades pressing on my shoulders, but also the undeniable lightness of finally turning pain into purpose. As I walked through the town square, speaking to anyone who would listen, I realized my fight had never been just for me. It had been for every girl who had been told she was worthless, for every child whose home was a prison, for every family shattered by greed and cruelty. I spoke of my stepfather, of the merchants and powerful men who profited from fear, of the lies that kept victims silent, and slowly, walls that had stood for decades began to crack in hearts, in minds, and eventually in laws. By evening, I stood on the steps of the old town hall, the sky burning with orange and violet streaks. My brothers, Maria and Toinho, now grown, were by my side, their eyes reflecting pride and pain in equal measure. "We're proud of you," Toinho whispered. Maria squeezed my hand. We had survived together, and now we were claiming our story, our dignity, and our right to exist without fear. The community had rallied, and with their support, Willow Creek established shelters, educational programs, and advocacy initiatives. What had been a town of silence and complicity began to transform into a place of vigilance and protection. Every meeting I attended, every speech I gave, every article I wrote reminded me that survival was not the end. It was the beginning of responsibility, action, and change. As night fell, I finally returned to the little churchyard where my mother rested. I knelt by her grave, the wind soft and warm against my skin. "I forgive you, Mom," I whispered, tears flowing freely. "I forgive myself, too, and I will keep fighting, not just for me, but for every child who can't yet fight for herself." The moon rose slowly, casting a silver light over the gravestone, and I felt a calm I had never known. In that moment, I understood that the scars of the past were not chains, but reminders of survival. My story, once buried under shame, fear, and silence, had become a beacon. The little girl who had been sold for 3 sacks of flour, who had feared every shadow and every whisper, had grown into a woman who could speak, act, and change the world. I walked home under the moonlight, my brothers beside me, carrying the weight of the past, but also the unbreakable strength of survival. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that while the darkness would always linger, it could never extinguish the light we chose to carry forward. I had reclaimed my life, rewritten my story, and transformed decades of suffering into a legacy of hope, justice, and resilience. And for the first time in years, I felt truly free.